A struggling, lonely girl got tortured for 3 days protecting a dog she didn't even own. When the most dangerous man in Chicago found out, he burned the city down looking for her. It was a November night in Chicago, the kind of cold that cut straight to the bone, the kind that turned breath into white smoke the instant it left your lips. Josie Brennan zipped her coat up to her chin and stepped out of the gas station where she'd just finished the night shift. It was close to 5 in the morning. The streets of the South Side were empty. Nothing but wind slipping through the gaps between run-down old buildings and the weak yellow flicker of streetlights trembling over wet asphalt. She was hungry, a familiar hunger, the kind she'd lived with for years, a steady, dull burn in her stomach that she'd learned to ignore. The last thing she'd eaten was half a packet of instant noodles at noon yesterday, split in 2 because she'd saved the other half for tomorrow morning. Her worn-out sneakers tapped a tired rhythm on the cracked sidewalk. She was so exhausted that every step had to be forced. Every breath felt heavy. 12 hours standing behind a register under harsh fluorescent lights. 12 hours smiling at customers, counting small change, mopping floors, enduring the stink of gasoline and the bitter scorch of cheap coffee. All of it just to earn a paycheck big enough to cover rent on a studio the size of someone else's closet. Josie was 27. Thin, dark brown hair tied in a messy knot at the nape of her neck. A sharp-angled face with gray eyes that always carried caution, the look of someone who learned far too early not to trust anyone. She turned into the familiar shortcut alley that led home. The same alley she walked every night. The same brick walls covered in graffiti and trash bins, breathing damp rot. She wasn't afraid of the dark. She'd lived in darkness her whole life, in every sense of the word. Foster care since she was 4 years old. 7 foster families over 13 years. And not one of them kept her long enough for her to call it home. The last family was the worst, but that was a story she'd buried so deep that even in nightmares she only saw fragments, never the whole picture. She ran away at 17, lived on the streets, taught herself how to survive. And somehow she was still here, not living, just existing, but still here. She passed the narrow side lane beside the closed laundromat, where 3 stray cats usually sheltered. Out of habit, she stopped and pulled a small handful of dry cat food from her coat pocket, food she bought with leftover coins each week. She sprinkled it along the low wall. A tabby stepped out carefully, sniffed, then ate. Josie squatted and watched for a moment. Her eyes softened, a softness no one at the gas station or out on the street ever saw. With animals, she was different, always different. They didn't judge, didn't abandon, didn't promise and then break it. They were simply there, and sometimes that was enough. She stood and kept walking. Her studio was on the 3rd floor of an old building with no elevator, windows patched with tape, a heating system that had been broken since last winter and a landlord who couldn't be bothered to fix it. She climbed the stairs in the dark, opened the door, flipped on the light. The ceiling bulb flickered for a few seconds before it steadied, a sickly yellow glow spilling over the 15 square meters that held her entire life. A single metal frame bed. A mini fridge humming, a folding table that served as a dining table and a desk. No photos on the wall, no paintings, nothing that suggested this place belonged to anyone. Josie shut the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and pulled off her shoes. Her heels were blistered. She looked at the remaining half packet of noodles on the table, her breakfast. She thought about the second job, the prep shift at Ruthie's diner at 10 in the morning. 5 hours from now, 5 hours to sleep, if she could sleep. She lay down, pulled the blanket up, and closed her eyes. Outside, Chicago roared through the night. Car horns, someone shouting down on the street, wind screaming through the seams of a window held together by tape. Josie Brennan lay curled in the dark, alone, like every other night for the past 10 years. She didn't know that in less than 24 hours, she'd find a dying dog in an alley. She didn't know that dog belonged to the most dangerous man in Chicago. And she certainly didn't know that choosing not to abandon it would get her tortured for 3 straight days. But it would also change her life forever. If Josie's story touched you, please like and share so more people can hear it. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next stories. And leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, how you feel, and rate this story on a scale of 10. 5 hours after Josie closed her eyes in the dark studio, the alarm on her cracked screen phone began to ring. She couldn't remember whether she'd actually slept or merely lay there waiting for morning to come. Her body ached all over, her shoulders stiff, her legs still throbbing from the night shift before. She sat up, pulled the blanket down, looked at the half packet of noodles on the table, and didn't touch it. She was saving it, not because she wasn't hungry, but because she was far too used to calculating every bite, dividing every meal, stretching every single day. She washed her face with cold water since the heater had been broken for 3 months, tied her hair into a loose knot at the nape of her neck, pulled on a faded t-shirt washed thin with time, and stepped outside. November mornings in Chicago weren't much warmer than the nights, but there was sunlight, a pale, fragile kind, that filtered through gray clouds as if the city had to ration every ray before giving it away. Josie walked 6 blocks to Ruthie's Diner, a small place on a south side corner, the kind with a hand-painted sign, long faded, menus taped to the glass door, and the smell of hot grease spilling onto the sidewalk before dawn. Josie pushed through the back door into the kitchen, and before she could hang her coat on its hook, she heard Ruthie's voice from the main stove. "Josie Brennan, sit down." Ruthie stood by the gas range, a white apron stained with oil, salt and pepper hair twisted high, broad hands flipping eggs in a cast-iron pan. She was 58, solidly built, her back slightly bent from decades on her feet, but her voice had never bent. It was sharp, it carried, and it didn't accept argument. She pointed to a wooden chair beside the prep table, where a plate of eggs, 2 slices of toast, and a steaming cup of coffee were already waiting. "You eat first, then you work." Josie wanted to say she wasn't hungry, but they both knew that would be a lie. She sat down, picked up the fork, and ate. Not fast, not slow, the way someone eats who learned young to hide hunger. The way someone eats who doesn't want anyone to see that this might be the only decent meal of the day. Ruthie didn't look at her. She turned back to the stove, flipped eggs for customers, but her eyes slid over once, quick, just enough to confirm Josie was eating, and only then did she settle. Their relationship hadn't begun with stories or confessions. 2 years earlier, Josie had walked in asking for a job, thin enough that Ruthie looked at her and didn't ask about experience, only asked when she'd last eaten. Josie didn't answer. Ruthie set down a plate of rice, sat across from her, and said 4 words, "Eat first, then we'll talk." From that day on, Josie worked morning prep, the pay small but steady, and Ruthie always made sure she ate before her shift and had food to take home after. She didn't ask about foster care. She didn't ask about the past. She knew enough from the fragments Josie dropped over 2 years. The way she flinched when someone touched her shoulder, the nights she texted to swap shifts because she didn't want to walk home in the dark, the way she never sat with her back to a door. Ruthie understood without needing the whole story. And she gave Josie something 7 foster families never had: unconditional presence. "You don't need to thank me, girl. You just need to finish your plate." Ruthie said that at least 3 times a week, every time Josie tried to say thank you or tried to pay for the meal. She said it in a gruff voice, but her eyes were never gruff. The prep shift that day passed like any other. Josie washed dishes, chopped vegetables, wiped counters, helped clear tables when the diner grew crowded. Ruthie worked the stove, scolded the new kitchen hand for slicing onions too thick, complained about a regular who ordered his eggs well done, and then grumbled they were dry, and told a story about her neighbor's cat digging up her garden. Josie listened, smiling now and then, speaking little. She didn't need to speak much here. Ruthie's kitchen was the only place she was allowed to be quiet without anyone thinking she was strange. At the end of the shift, Josie hung up her apron and reached for her coat. Ruthie had already slipped a foil-wrapped bundle into her pocket. Inside was still warm chicken sandwich and 2 apples. Josie didn't need to open it to know. Ruthie did it every day, as if it were part of the job description and not kindness. Josie paused at the back door and turned to look at Ruthie wiping down the prep table. Ruthie glanced up and met her eyes. "Get home safe, girl." Josie nodded and pushed the door open. Cold wind hit her face at once. She zipped her coat up, pressed a hand over the sandwich in her pocket, and began walking back toward the gas station for the night shift. She didn't turn around again. She didn't know she should have. She should have looked back. She should have taken one more long look at Ruthie's face under the pale yellow kitchen lights, because that afternoon was the last time anything in her life was still normal. At the same time, Josie stepped out of Ruthie's diner and headed toward the gas station for her night shift, on the other side of the city, on the 43rd floor of a glass tower overlooking the entire Chicago skyline. Another man was opening his eyes. Paxton Corey's penthouse spanned nearly 400 square meters, all dark interiors, black marble, leather sofas, smoked oak tables, curtains always drawn shut. There were no family photographs on the walls, no flowers. Nothing that suggested someone lived here instead of merely existed. The apartment cost more than the entire building where Josie rented her studio. Yet they shared the same thing: emptiness. Paxton lay on his bed, eyes open but unmoving. 36 years old, black hair cut short, Greek features sharp as if carved with a blade, a square jaw, steel gray eyes that never revealed anything he didn't intend. His body carried the kind of strength forged, not gifted. Broad shoulders, thick hands, muscle concealed beneath expensive fabric. On his left chest was a tattoo of a serpent coiled around ancient Greek letters no one dared ask about. He remained still for a few seconds longer, then felt the familiar weight at the foot of the bed. Ares. The Neapolitan Mastiff lay curled at the end of the mattress. 65 kilograms of flesh and bone and heavy folds of skin. Slate gray coat draped over a massive frame, a head the size of a pillow, resting on crossed paws. The dog wasn't asleep. He was watching Paxton with patient, clouded brown eyes, waiting for him to fully wake. His tail thumped once when Paxton shifted. Paxton sat up and reached down to stroke the dog's ear. The hand that had crushed throats, that had signed orders wiping entire rival families off the map, now moved gently over velvet fur as if touching something fragile. "Good morning, you lazy beast." His voice was low, almost a whisper, carrying a warmth no one in his empire had ever heard. He only spoke to Ares in that tone, in the voice that belonged to another version of Paxton Corey, the version that existed before his younger brother died. Ares let out a soft rumble and pushed his enormous head into Paxton's palm, tail wagging harder. Paxton closed his eyes for a second, fingers scratching behind the dog's ear in the exact place he loved. And in that moment his face changed. Not much, just enough. The line between his brows eased, his jaw unclenched, the corners of his eyes softened. Then he opened them and looked at the only photograph in the bedroom, placed on the nightstand in a tarnished silver frame. In the picture was a young man, much younger than him, round-faced, bright-eyed, smiling so widely it was hard to believe he carried the name Kor. Nico, his brother. Beside Nico in the photograph was Ares as a puppy, ears too large for his head, paws too big for his body, wrinkled muzzle staring seriously into the camera in a way that was almost comical. Nico held him in both arms, chin resting on the dog's head, grinning. The photo had been taken 3 years ago. Nico had died 2 years ago, shot 4 times in a parking lot behind the family restaurant, in broad daylight, over a territorial dispute Nico had nothing to do with. His brother wasn't in the life. Nico went to college, wanted to become a veterinarian, hated guns, hated violence, and was the only person in the world who could tell Paxton Corey he was living the wrong way without provoking his anger. Nico died, and the only thing he left behind was the dog. Paxton remembered the day he stood in the morgue identifying his brother's body. He remembered not crying. He remembered driving back to the penthouse and finding Ares sitting at the door waiting for Nico to come home, tail wagging, eyes bright, not knowing his owner would never walk through that door again. That night, Paxton sat on the floor holding the dog and said a single sentence: "I promise I'll keep him safe." From that moment on, Ares went everywhere with him, not because the dog was trained to, but because Paxton wouldn't allow him out of sight. Ares sat at his feet in every meeting, lay beside him in the car, slept on his bed every night, and everyone in the Corey Empire knew the unspoken rule: touch the dog and you die. No explanation. No second warning. 45 minutes later, Paxton walked into a meeting room in the basement of a Greek restaurant owned by the family. He wore a black suit, black shirt, no tie. Ares moved at his right side, claws clicking steadily against the stone floor. 6 men were already seated at the table, all of them standing the moment he entered. No one looked at the dog. No one looked where they shouldn't. Sawyer had been in the room before him, standing against the wall behind Paxton's chair, silent as a shadow. 40 years old, half a head taller than Paxton, hair cut close, expression unreadable, eyes scanning the room constantly, with the habit of someone who had killed enough to recognize danger on sight. Sawyer didn't speak unless addressed, didn't sit while his boss stood, didn't stray more than 3 meters from Paxton unless ordered. He was the bodyguard, the right hand, the only man who knew the safe combination, and more importantly, the only man besides Ares who had ever seen Paxton Corey reveal anything other than cold restraint. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Territory, money, shipments, routes. Paxton listened, questioned, issued orders. His voice remained level, sharp. neither rising nor falling. Yet every sentence carried the weight of a man who knew his words would be obeyed without question. When a subordinate stammered an explanation about a lost shipment, Paxton didn't shout. He simply looked at him. Silence. Steel-gray eyes resting on the man's face for exactly 5 seconds. The man went pale, swallowed, and promised to fix it. Paxton gave a single nod and moved to the next topic as if he'd just finished dealing with a mosquito. At his feet, Aries lay still, head on his paws, eyes half closed. The dog didn't care about power, territory, or money. He cared only about the man seated above him, the man who stroked his ears each morning in a voice no one else was allowed to hear. And that man, the crime lord Chicago feared, would sometimes lower his hand beneath the table, quietly, where no one could see, and scratch the dog's neck. No one in the room knew. Only Sawyer, standing behind him, saw. And he said nothing. He never said anything. While the meeting at the Greek restaurant ended, and Paxton stepped out through the back door with Aries striding beside him, on the south side of the city, in the basement of an abandoned car wash the police never bothered to look at, Bryce Hadley sat in a torn leather swivel chair, his feet propped on a desk, watching images on a tablet. 33 years old, dirty blonde hair cut neat, clean face with no tattoos and no scars. He looked more like a bank employee than a mid-level drug boss controlling 3 southern districts of Chicago. That was precisely what made Bryce dangerous. He didn't look dangerous. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't carry a gun at his hip to impress anyone. He read books. He analyzed. And he played the long game. On the screen in front of him were candid photographs taken over the past 3 months. Paxton Corey stepping out of a car, Aries at his side. Paxton sitting on his penthouse balcony, Aries at his feet. Paxton entering a restaurant, Aries following behind. Every image held the same constant, the dog. Bryce swiped through them slowly, his finger gliding across the screen as if he were reading a novel. He had spent 3 months studying Paxton Corey, not studying the empire, or the supply lines, or the territory, but studying the man. He knew he couldn't strike Paxton head-on. No one could. The Corey Empire had more guns, more money, more loyal men. A direct attack was suicide. But everyone had a weakness. Paxton Corey wasn't afraid of death. Bryce had confirmed that through 3 separate sources, the man had walked into gunfire without blinking. He wasn't afraid of losing money because money flowed back to him like water. He wasn't afraid of prison because no evidence had ever stuck to him. But the dog. Bryce zoomed in on a photograph of Paxton bending to stroke Aries' ear in a parking lot. The coldest face in Chicago softened in that instant, in a way that couldn't be mistaken. The dead brother's dog, he murmured to himself, his voice light, almost affectionate, as if admiring a clever move. The last keepsake. The only thing he still allows himself to love. He shut off the tablet and glanced at Abel, who stood against the wall waiting for orders. Abel was 29. Large, framed, rough-faced, cold-eyed, the kind of man born to follow instructions and never ask why. "Bring me the dog. Alive." Abel nodded without another word. Bryce leaned back in his chair, hands laced behind his head, eyes on the cracked ceiling. He smiled, the smile of a man who had just placed a piece on the board and knew his opponent hadn't seen it yet. That evening, Paxton had a second meeting at the restaurant, this time with shipping partners from the East Coast. The discussion ran long, complicated, demanding complete focus. Sawyer drove Paxton there, parked in the lot behind the restaurant, and as always remained in the car with Aries while the boss went inside. Aries lay on the back seat, wrinkled head resting against the doorframe, eyes half closed. Sawyer sat in the driver's seat, shoulders against the backrest, eyes scanning the rearview mirror out of habit. The parking lot was quiet. Streetlights flickered yellow. 2 cars were parked 20 meters away. Ordinary looking. Nothing that would draw a second glance. Sawyer didn't give them a second glance. That was the mistake. The gunshot cracked sharp and clean, 1 round through the driver's side window. Sawyer jerked left, his right hand clamping over his left shoulder where the bullet lodged into bone, blood spilling between his fingers. Before he could draw his weapon, the rear door was yanked open. 2 dark figures rushed in, one slamming Sawyer's head against the steering wheel, the other grabbing Aries by the chain collar. The dog growled and lunged, teeth sinking into the second man's arm, but a syringe plunged into his neck. Aries thrashed, the growl weakening. Then his massive body went limp. 15 seconds. From start to finish, 15 seconds. When the truck's engine roared away from the lot, Sawyer lay slumped in the driver's seat, blood running down his arm, his shaking hand pressing the only number in his phone. Inside the restaurant, Paxton was mid-sentence when the phone in his jacket vibrated. He never took calls during meetings. But this was Sawyer. Sawyer never called unless something was wrong. Paxton raised one finger, signaling the table to silence, and answered. 6 seconds. The call lasted 6 seconds. Sawyer spoke 3 sentences. Paxton heard all 3. Then he lowered the phone to the table slowly, gently, placing it on the wood without making a sound. The 6 men at the table watched him. None of them understood what had happened, but all of them felt it. Something in the room had shifted. The air thickened. The temperature seemed to drop. Paxton Correa sat motionless. He didn't shout. He didn't slam his fist. He didn't stand. His eyes were open, fixed straight ahead, but whatever light had been there was gone. Not anger. Anger was hot. Anger was loud. This was something else. Colder, deeper, quieter, and far more terrifying than any outburst. The men around the table stopped breathing. One subordinate almost spoke, but survival instinct sealed his mouth. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. 5 seconds. Absolute silence. Then Paxton spoke, his voice flat, low, steady, each word landing on the table like a bullet. Find my dog. At any cost. He rose to his feet. The chair slid back without a sound. He walked out of the room without looking back, without explanation. Within 1 hour, the order rippled through every corner of Chicago. Every soldier, every pair of eyes, every set of ears in the Correa Empire received the same message. Find the dog, bring him back, and find who took him. The city had never seen the Correa Empire move so fast, never seen so many dark figures spill into the streets in a single night, never felt fear spread so thick and heavy, all because of a dog. While the entire Corps Empire tore through every corner of Chicago that night, while Paxton sat in his dark penthouse staring at his phone waiting for news, while Sawyer lay on a sofa with his shoulder wrapped in white bandages already stained red and continued making calls to direct each search team, Josie Brennan knew nothing about any of it. She only knew that her night shift at the gas station had just ended, that it was close to 5 in the morning, and that tonight was colder than the one before. Wind off Lake Michigan cut straight through the open South Side streets, slipping through her thin coat as if the fabric didn't exist. Josie lowered her head, shoved both hands deep into her pockets, and walked quickly along the familiar sidewalk. The same route every night, the same brick walls, the same flickering yellow streetlights, the same stillness of the city in that fragile hour between late night and dawn, when even Chicago seemed too tired to stay awake. She turned into the narrow alley beside the closed laundromat, where she stopped each night to feed the stray cats. Her hand had already reached into her pocket for the small handful of dry food when she realized there were no cats. Not one. The ledge where they usually curled was empty. The hollow beneath the steps where the tabby liked to hide was vacant. Josie stood still for a second, her hand frozen in her pocket. Stray cats didn't disappear without reason. They disappeared when something bigger, something more dangerous, claimed their territory. Then she heard it. A groan, low, heavy, from deep inside the alley behind a large dumpster pressed against the wall. Not a cat, not a person. Something larger, something in pain, something desperate. Josie's first instinct told her to walk away. 10 years on, the streets had taught her that unfamiliar sounds in a dark alley at 5 in the morning were never good news. Keep walking. Go home. Lock the door. But her feet didn't listen. They carried her into the alley slowly, cautiously, one step at a time, while her mind screamed that this was stupid. She moved past the dumpster, the stench of damp rot and rust filling her lungs, and then she saw him. The dog lay on his side on the cold concrete beside a rusted pipe running along the wall. He was big. Bigger than any dog Josie had ever seen. At least 65 kilograms. A massive frame covered in short slate gray fur, heavy folds lining his face and neck, a head the size of a basketball. A thick iron chain was wrapped around the pipe, the other end locked to a collar tightened so harshly that the fur around his neck had been scraped away, the skin raw and red. But what made Josie stop breathing wasn't the chain. The dog's muzzle had been wired shut with stiff industrial steel, twisted tight, cutting grooves into the flesh around his nose and jaw. Dried blood crusted along both sides of his mouth. His body was mottled with bruises, gray fur stained with deep purple and black. His right front leg was swollen to twice its normal size, likely broken. He breathed in heavy pulls, each breath a low whimper, slow, pained, exhausted. Clouded brown eyes lifted to hers. Not aggressive, not threatening, only pain, fear, and something that looked like a plea. Josie dropped to her knees. Cold concrete bit through her jeans. Her hands trembled. Not from the cold, but from a surge of fury so sudden and violent she had to bite her lip to keep from screaming. Someone had done this. Someone had wired his mouth shut, chained him to a pipe, beaten him, and left him here to die in the freezing November night in Chicago. She reached out slowly so the dog could see her hand. He didn't growl. He didn't recoil. He only watched her with wet brown eyes and let out a faint sound, as if that was the only language he had left. Josie touched the steel wire around his muzzle. Hard, cold, twisted so tight she had to use both hands to unwind it. The metal sliced into her fingers, thin lines of red mixing with the dog's dried blood, but she didn't stop. She twisted, pulled, wrenched, her nails tore, her skin split, until the final loop slipped free. Aries released a long, broken sound when the pressure vanished, his jaw opening and closing slowly, as if he'd forgotten how to move it. He licked his lips, tasted blood, then looked up at her, and Josie looked back. 2 pairs of eyes met in the darkness of a South Side alley at 5 a.m. The clouded brown eyes of an abandoned dog, the gray eyes of an abandoned girl. Both of them knew exactly what that kind of pain looked like. Josie didn't know who the dog belonged to. She only knew he was too large, too well-bred, his fur too fine beneath the bruises to be a stray. Someone owned him. Someone beat him. Someone chained him here. She didn't think further, didn't calculate, didn't consider that she barely had enough money to feed herself, let alone a dog that weighed more than she did. She unlocked the chain, slipped her arm around his neck, and pulled. Aries struggled to stand, swaying. His right front leg lifted off the ground, all his weight shifting onto the remaining 3 legs and onto Josie's shoulder. She stumbled, nearly fell, but clutched his fur to steady them both. 65 kilograms leaning on 50. She stepped. He stepped. Slow, painful, 1 step at a time out of the alley, across cracked pavement, down the empty street, and up 3 flights of stairs with no elevator. Each step was torture for both of them. Josie panted, sweat sliding down her spine despite the freezing air. Aries whimpered with every movement but didn't stop, didn't collapse, didn't surrender. When she pushed open the studio door and they both fell inside, Josie hit the floor and the dog collapsed with her, and they lay there, 2 broken bodies tangled together in 15 square meters of flickering yellow light, breathing, just breathing. Josie didn't know how long she lay on the floor. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 20. She only knew that when she finally opened her eyes, the dog was still half draped over her, heavy enough that she had to push hard to sit up. Aries whimpered when she moved, his right front leg swollen and curled inward, his eyes closing and opening again as he looked at her with complete exhaustion but no fear. He wasn't afraid of her. That alone was enough to make Josie get to her feet. She looked around her 15-square-meter studio and, for the first time, realized how small it truly was, with an extra 65 kilograms of living creature stretched across the floor. The bathroom. She needed warm water, needed to wash away the blood, needed to see those injuries clearly. She wasn't a doctor, wasn't a veterinarian, but she had once stitched a gash in her own leg with a sewing needle and regular thread at 16, so at least she knew what blood looked like, and knew that wounds left dirty would fester. She dragged Aries toward the bathroom. Dragged wasn't quite the right word. She coaxed him, because the dog weighed twice as much as she did, and she couldn't force him to do anything. She crouched on the bathroom tiles, patted the floor gently, and called him in the softest voice she had. "Come here. Come on." Aries looked at her, then slowly, painfully, pulled himself inside. He filled the bathroom completely, literally every inch. Josie had to curl herself into the corner of the tub, knees drawn up, back against the cold ceramic wall, just to have space to work. The hot water heater had been broken since last winter, so she boiled 2 pots of water on the stove, carried them in, poured them into a plastic basin. She tore an old towel into strips, dipped them into the warm water, and began to clean, gently, slowly, 1 bruise at a time, 1 patch of dried blood at a time. Aries whimpered when she touched a tender spot, his body tensing, but he didn't pull away. He didn't growl. He didn't bare his teeth. He only watched her with clouded brown eyes, patient, as if he understood that this hand was different. This hand didn't strike. This hand was trying to heal. She used the small bottle of antiseptic she'd bought from the dollar store, the cheapest one, $2, something she'd purchased last month to treat the blisters on her feet. She poured it over the torn flesh around his muzzle where the steel wire had cut deepest. Aries flinched and cried out louder, but he still didn't bite. She whispered to him while she worked. Nothing meaningful, just soft, steady sounds repeated over and over, the kind of sounds she'd once wished someone would say to her when she was young and hurting. When the wounds were as clean as she could make them, she looked around for food. The mini fridge held half a packet of noodles, the breakfast she'd saved, 1 can of tuna, nothing else. She cooked the noodles, mixed in the tuna, poured it into a plastic bowl, and set it in front of Aries along with a bowl of clean water. The dog lifted his head, sniffed, and began to eat. Not fast, not frantic, the way an animal eats who's known hunger and doesn't trust that food will still be there if he hesitates. Josie sat and watched him. Her stomach was hollow, twisting in on itself, but she smiled, a small smile, meant for no one but the dog. The smile of someone who had just given away the last thing she owned and didn't feel deprived. Aries licked the bowl clean, licked the water bowl clean. Then he turned to her, his massive, wrinkled head moving slowly until it settled in her lap, heavy, warm. His ears drooped to either side, his brown eyes half closed in trust so complete and absolute that only animals know how to give it, without proof, without promises, only feeling. Josie sat on the tiny bathroom floor of her 15-square-meter studio, her back against the sink. A 65-kilogram dog curled into her, and for the first time in years, she cried. Not from pain, not from exhaustion, not from hunger, or cold, or loneliness. She cried because a living creature needed her, and because she, for the first time since she'd run away from her last foster home at 17, needed someone too. She wrapped both arms around the dog's neck, pressed her face into the warm slate-gray fur, and cried until there were no tears left. Then she whispered, her voice breaking, so soft only Aries could hear. I don't know who you belong to, but tonight you're mine, and I won't let anyone hurt you again. Aries licked the tears from her cheek. His tongue was warm, rough, surprisingly gentle for something so large. Then his tail moved. Once, slow, weak, but clear. Josie opened her eyes and didn't know where she was. Then she felt the cold tile beneath her back, the stiffness in her neck from sleeping upright all night, and the warm weight across her thighs. Aries. The massive wrinkled head was still resting in her lap, brown eyes open, watching her with the quiet patience of a creature that had been awake for a long time but hadn't moved because he didn't want to wake her. Early light filtered through the tape-patched window, pale and thin, falling in slanted stripes across the tiny bathroom floor. Josie looked down at the dog. The dog looked up at her, and she felt something so unfamiliar it took her a few seconds to recognize it. Not alone. For the first time in 10 years, she had woken beside something alive, something warm, breathing, and choosing to stay. She sat there a while longer, her hand stroking Aries' ear, unwilling to break the moment. But her stomach cramped with hunger, and the dog needed water. She stood carefully, lowering his head to the floor, and shuffled into the kitchen. She boiled water in a small pot on the gas stove, and made her last packet of instant coffee, the kind she bought 10 for $1 at the discount store. She poured fresh water into a plastic bowl for Aries. The dog limped out of the bathroom, his right front leg still lifted off the ground, moving slowly but determined enough to reach the bowl and drink. Josie sat on the kitchen floor, her back against the mini fridge, both hands wrapped around the hot cup, watching the enormous dog bend to drink from a cheap plastic bowl on the cracked tile of her 4-square-meter kitchen. The most ordinary moment in the world. A girl drinking coffee, a dog drinking water, morning light slipping through a taped window. To anyone else it would have meant nothing. To Josie it was everything. Then came the pounding on the door, hard, relentless, not knocking, fists, kicks. The entire studio shook. Coffee sloshed over the rim of her cup. Aries lifted his head, ears rising, body stiffening, a low growl vibrating deep in his chest. Josie froze for a second. Her heart slammed into her throat. 10 years alone had taught her that no one pounded on a door like that to bring good news. The next second instinct took over. She set the cup down, grabbed Aries by the collar, and dragged him toward the bathroom. The dog weighed twice as much as she did, but he felt her urgency and followed, limping as fast as he could. Josie shoved him inside, shut the door, turned the lock, and spun back around. The fifth kick, the sixth. The hinges trembled. Dust shook loose from the frame. The seventh kick and the door burst inward, the cheap lock ripping free from rotted wood, the panel slamming against the wall. 3 men stepped inside. The first was Abel, broad-shouldered, rough-faced, cold-eyed, the man Bryce Hadley had sent to steal Aries the night before. The 2 behind him were smaller, carrying metal bats and rope. Abel scanned the tiny studio, his gaze sweeping over the bed, the table, the floor, then stopping on Josie. He wasn't surprised to see her. A security camera in the alley near the laundromat had shown Bryce enough. A thin, brown-haired girl dragging a massive dog through the night. Finding her address had taken only hours. "Bring out the dog," Abel said, his voice flat, not threatening because he didn't need to be. He was twice her size and had 2 men with weapons behind him. Josie stood in the middle of the room, small in her faded shirt, hair tangled, face pale with fear. She was shaking. Truly shaking, from her fingertips to her knees. But she didn't step back. She moved sideways, placing herself in front of the bathroom door where Aries was scratching and growling on the other side, and she said one word. "No." Abel looked at her. She looked back. He tilted his head slightly, as if he hadn't heard correctly, then stepped forward. Fast. One hand grabbed her arm, yanked her away from the bathroom, and threw her aside. Josie hit the floor, her head striking the iron bed frame, stars bursting in her vision. She tried to get up, and the second man kicked her in the stomach, folding her in half, knocking the air from her lungs. The third backhanded her so hard she spun halfway around, blood from her split lip spraying onto the tile. Inside the bathroom, Aries heard everything. The sound of Josie falling, the sound of her choking breath, and the 65-kilogram dog, leg broken, body bruised, hurled himself against the bathroom door with all the force he had left. The thin wood gave way. Aries burst out, jaws open, a growl ripping from deep in his chest. Brown eyes turned into something wild. He launched at Abel, teeth clamping down on his forearm, locking. Abel shouted, jerking his arm. But when a Neapolitan Mastiff locks his jaw, it doesn't release. The second man swung the metal bat. It struck Aries in the ribs. The dog cried out, his grip slipping, staggering. The third swung again, this time into the already shattered right front leg. Aries collapsed, a sound tearing from him, the cry of an animal that had given everything, and still it wasn't enough. Abel snapped a chain around his neck, fast and brutal, tightening the steel collar. Josie crawled across the floor, blood dripping from her mouth onto the tiles, reaching for Aries, trying to scream, though the kick to her stomach had stolen her breath. Don't touch him." Abel didn't listen. He dragged Aries out. The second man grabbed Josie, stuffed a cloth into her mouth, tied her hands behind her back with rope. They were both thrown into the back of a truck waiting in the alley. Aries lay on one side, chain biting into his neck, breathing heavy, his right leg now completely useless. Josie lay on the other, mouth gagged, eyes wet, staring at the dog through the darkness of the truck bed. Aries looked back at her. His tail didn't move. His eyes were dark, deep, desperate, but he didn't look away. He looked at her, and she looked at him. The entire jolting ride across broken pavement toward an abandoned warehouse in the industrial west side of Chicago, where Bryce Hadley was already waiting. The warehouse sat at the far edge of an abandoned industrial district on the west side of Chicago, the kind of place even rats had given up on long ago. Gray concrete walls, a ceiling 10 meters high crossed with rusted steel beams, a cracked concrete floor stained with old engine oil. 4 fluorescent lights hung from exposed wiring, 2 dead, 2 flickering without rhythm, casting a sickly yellow glow that made everything look like a scene from a low-budget horror film. It was cold, cold enough that breath turned to smoke. The air smelled of oil, rust, damp cement, and something sour that took Josie a moment to recognize as the scent of her own fear. She was tied to a metal chair in the center of the warehouse. The chair was bolted to the floor. It didn't move. It didn't shift. Rope bound her wrists to the armrests, tight enough that every small movement scraped skin raw. Her ankles were lashed to the legs of the chair. She wasn't going anywhere. About 10 meters away, in the opposite corner, Aries was chained to a steel column. The chain was short, tight against his collar, forcing him to lie down or sit but never fully stand. close enough that Josie could see the brown of his eyes beneath the flickering light, far enough that she couldn't touch him. The distance was intentional. She knew that. They wanted her to see him. Abel stood in front of her, sleeves rolled up, calm as a man beginning his morning shift. The other two sat on wooden crates behind him, smoking, watching as if this were entertainment. Abel asked, "Where did you get the dog?" Josie answered, "In an alley." "Who told you to take him?" "No one. I saw he was hurt. I brought him home." "Do you know who the dog belongs to?" "No." "Do you know Paxton Corey?" "No." "I don't know who Paxton Corey is." Abel didn't believe her. Or maybe he didn't care whether she was telling the truth, because he hit her immediately after the answer. Not with a bat, not with a tool, just his fist. One punch to the stomach that folded her forward and stole the air from her lungs, tears springing from her eyes without permission. Then a slap, sharp and precise, snapping her head to the left, reopening the split in her lip, blood spraying again. Then the question repeated. The same question, the same answer, the same result. Josie lost track of how many times he struck her. After a while, the world reduced itself to a pattern. Question, silence, pain, question, silence, pain. Her lips split further. Blood ran from her nose down her chin and onto her shirt. Her wrists turned dark with bruises, where the rope cut deeper each time she flinched. She didn't scream, not because she was brave, but because she'd forgotten how. Foster care had taught her that screaming didn't bring help. No one came when she screamed. Then Abel stopped. He turned and walked toward Aries. The dog growled when he approached, teeth bared, chain rattling against steel. Abel didn't hesitate. He drove his boot into Aries' ribs, hard, the leather toe slamming into bone. Aries yelped, body curling inward, the sound echoing against the empty concrete walls. Josie heard that sound, and something inside her broke. Not bone, not skin, the last thin barrier between fear and something stronger than fear. She screamed. The first real scream, her voice cracking, raw, filling the warehouse. "Don't hit the dog. Hit me. Hit me instead." Abel paused, his foot still near Aries' side. He turned slowly to look at her, tilting his head as if she'd just offered something interesting. The two men behind him stopped smoking. They watched her. Josie was shaking, face smeared with blood, eyes wet but unblinking as she stared straight at him. "Hit me, not him. I can take it." Abel studied her for 3 seconds more, then smiled. A slow, cold smile. The smile of a man who'd just discovered a more entertaining game. "Fine." He walked back toward her. And the first day truly began. Josie didn't remember when it ended. Only that at some point the flickering lights blurred into streaks, Abel's voice dissolved into a dull hum, and pain became a constant background noise like white static. Then they left. Lights off. The iron door slammed shut. An engine roared, faded, disappeared. Silence, darkness, bitter cold. The rope around one of her wrists had been loosened when they untied her briefly to force water between her lips. She wrenched the other free herself, skin tearing as it slid against coarse fibers. She slipped from the chair and collapsed onto the concrete floor, lying there for a moment just to breathe. Then she crawled, 10 meters. 10 meters from the chair to the corner where Aries was chained. She dragged herself across the freezing floor, bruised hands pushing inch by inch, knees scraping against rough cement, until her fingers touched slate-gray fur. Aries whimpered when she reached him, but not from fear. He shifted closer, his 65-kilogram body pressing against hers, blocking the draft that seeped through cracks in the metal door. Josie curled beside him, face buried against his neck, arms wrapped around his thick body, trembling. Cold, hurt, afraid, but not alone. She whispered into the darkness, told Aries about the 3 stray cats outside the laundromat, the tabby who rubbed against her legs, the black one too shy to eat first, the calico who was fattest because she stole from the others. She told him about Ruthie, the stubborn old woman who forced her to eat breakfast every day and slipped sandwiches into her coat pocket. She told him about a dream she'd never spoken aloud, a small house somewhere outside Chicago, a backyard with green grass, space for a dog to run. "You know something. You're the most beautiful thing I've ever found." Aries let out a soft rumble, his tail thudding once against the concrete, his brown eyes never leaving her in the dark. 2 abandoned creatures curled into each other on the frozen warehouse floor, and somehow, between concrete and chain and dried blood, They kept each other alive through the first night. On the morning of the second day, the iron warehouse door opened again. Abel walked in with the same two men, carrying coffee, cigarettes, and the patience of someone who treated violence like an office job. Josie had dragged herself back toward the chair before they arrived, curling on the floor beside it because she didn't have the strength to climb onto it alone. Abel looked at her without speaking, hauled her up, tied her back in place. He asked the same questions. Who told you to take the dog? Who are you working for? Josie gave the same answers. No one. I found him. I don't know anything. Abel didn't believe her. Or maybe belief no longer mattered. The second day was heavier. Josie knew because she heard her own bone break. The sound was clear, dry, sharp, when the toe of Abel's boot drove into her left ribs. A crack. Not one. Two. The pain was so bright the world went white for 2 seconds. She couldn't breathe. Her mouth opened, but no air came. Her lungs refused to work. She folded over in the chair, face turning gray, until finally a thin breath forced its way in, shallow and burning, like inhaling knives. After that, every breath was torture. Abel pulled out a cigarette, lit it, took a long drag and watched her through the smoke. He held the cigarette between 2 fingers, turned the glowing tip toward her hand tied to the armrest, and pressed it down. Josie bit her lip, bit hard enough that blood ran down her chin, but she didn't scream. Not because it didn't hurt. It hurt so badly her vision flashed, and her body jerked against the ropes, driving the coarse fibers deeper into her wrists. She didn't scream because she could see Aries in the opposite corner. She could see him thrashing against the chain every time she made a sound, the metal collar tearing skin from his neck, blood seeping into gray fur. She knew that if she screamed, he'd pull harder. He'd hurt himself worse. He'd kill himself trying to reach her. So she swallowed the sound and let it die inside her. The smell of burning skin filled the air, tobacco and flesh. Aries growled wildly, the sound vibrating through the warehouse, chain slamming against steel with violent clangs. But the chain was too short and the dog too broken to break free. He could only watch and growl and strain until his skin tore, unable to reach her. At the same time, 25 kilometers east, in the penthouse on the 43rd floor, Paxton Corey stood at the window staring down at Chicago and seeing nothing. He hadn't eaten on the second day. He hadn't slept since the night Aries was taken. Sawyer stood behind him, left shoulder wrapped in white bandages, arm suspended in a sling, face gray with exhaustion but still on the phone, issuing orders, receiving reports, tearing through every inch of the city. Nothing. The Corey empire controlled half of Chicago, but Bryce had hidden the dog more carefully than Paxton anticipated. 3 of Bryce's low-level men had been captured in the past 24 hours. Paxton tortured all 3. None of them knew where the dog was. Or if they did, they feared Bryce more than they feared Paxton, which said enough on its own. Sawyer looked at his boss and saw something he'd never seen in 12 years beside this man. Paxton Corey was breaking. Slowly, quietly, but breaking. That night, Paxton walked into Nico's room. The room at the end of the penthouse hallway that he never opened in front of anyone. Everything remained exactly as it had been the day Nico died. The single bed still unmade, a bookmark still marking the last page Nico had read, a jacket hanging behind the door, carrying a scent Paxton told himself was still his brother, though it was probably only old fabric now. He sat on his brother's bed, back against the wall, holding the silver frame from the nightstand, Nico and Aries, his brother smiling wide, the wrinkled puppy staring at the camera with solemn seriousness. The photograph had been taken 3 years ago in the family restaurant kitchen. Nico had just brought Aries home, had just bathed him, the fur still fluffed and unruly, Nico cradling him like an infant. Paxton remembered that day. Remembered looking at Nico holding the dog and saying, "Are you insane? He'll grow as big as a cow." Nico laughed and said, "He was locked in an iron cage in the black market. I couldn't leave him there." And Paxton had said nothing more, because Nico was the only person who could silence him with nothing but a smile. Paxton's hand trembled. The frame shook slightly in his grip. Sawyer stood at the partially open door and saw it, and for the first time in 12 years, he wanted to look away because he couldn't bear what he was witnessing. Paxton Corey, the man Chicago feared, sitting on his dead brother's bed, clutching a photograph, whispering, "I promised you. I promised." That night in the warehouse, Abel and his men left again. Darkness returned. Cold returned. Josie crawled to Aries and curled beside him, each breath a blade because of the broken ribs. her burned hand throbbing when it brushed his fur. Aries pressed himself against her, resting his head against her stomach, letting out a soft, aching sound. They both shook from the cold. Josie wanted to tell stories like she had the night before, but her voice was nearly gone. Instead, she sang, soft, barely audible, almost just breath shaped into melody. A lullaby an elderly woman from her third foster home had once sung to her, the only kind home she'd known, where she'd stayed 6 months before the system moved her again for administrative reasons no one explained. Josie had forgotten the woman's name. She hadn't forgotten the song. The melody was simple, the words gentle, the kind of song meant to carry a child safely into sleep. She sang it in a cracked whisper, each note hurting because her broken ribs pressed against her lungs. Aries stopped whimpering when he heard it. The massive dog lay still, head against her abdomen, brown eyes slowly closing, breathing steadying. Josie sang until her voice disappeared completely, until there was nothing left but silence and breath, and 2 battered bodies pressed together on the freezing concrete floor, 2 abandoned souls holding each other alive through the second night. On the third day, Josie couldn't fully open her eyes. Her left eyelid was swollen shut, the right could only part a thin slit, just enough to catch the flicker of fluorescent light through a haze of tears and dried blood. She lay on the concrete floor beside Aries, exactly where she had remained through the night. No strength left to crawl back to the chair. 3 days without food. The only water she'd had were the mouthfuls Abel poured between interrogations, not out of mercy but because he needed her conscious enough to keep answering. Her body had reached its limit. Broken ribs pressed into her lungs with every breath, shallow, short, agony threaded through each inhale. Her burned hand had swollen to twice its size, blisters clouded and tight. Her left cheekbone was likely fractured, half her face numb and rigid with swelling. Her lips had split into several cuts, dried blood crusted dark along the edges. She looked like a corpse except for one thing, her eye. The narrow opening of her right eye still searched for Aries each time she surfaced. The dog lay pressed against her, his head resting on her arm, breathing heavy. He was exhausted too. His right leg had swollen grotesquely, no longer moving at all. The skin around his neck was torn raw from 2 days of straining against the chain. But he hadn't left her. Not once. The iron door opened. Footsteps. Not Abel. These steps were lighter, slower, measured. The sound of polished leather striking concrete, steady and assured. Bryce Hadley entered the warehouse for the first time since ordering Aries taken. He wore a black wool coat, tailored trousers, hair neatly combed, looking as though he were heading to lunch rather than inspecting prisoners. Abel followed and remained by the door. Bryce stopped in front of Josie and looked down. She lay curled on the floor, blood-soaked, clothes torn, hand burned, face swollen beyond recognition. Yet her left hand still gripped Aris's chain, fingers clenched so tightly the bruises imprinted deep into her palm. Bryce tilted his head. Something flickered across his eyes. Not pity. Bryce Hadley didn't possess pity, but perhaps surprise. Real surprise. He glanced at Abel. 3 days? Abel nodded. And she still won't let go? Abel shook his head. She doesn't know anything, boss. I believe she's telling the truth. She found the dog in an alley. Didn't know whose it was. Bryce looked back at Josie. He crouched slowly, resting his elbows on his knees, lowering himself to her level. Josie felt his shadow block the light and forced her right eye to open wider. She saw a clean face, bright eyes, a faint smile. She didn't know who he was, but she knew he was the one giving orders. "You're still alive?" Bryce said softly, almost politely. "My men beat you for 3 days and you still won't let go of the dog?" Josie didn't answer at once, not because she refused, but because she had to gather what little strength remained. Each word was labor, forcing air through crushed ribs, through a throat cracked dry, past split lips. "He doesn't have anyone else." 4 words. It cost her everything left. Bryce went silent. 1 second. 2. He looked at her, then at the dog, then back at her. Something passed through his gaze, too quick to pin down. Surprise, disdain, perhaps a thin sliver of something that resembled respect for an opponent who could endure pain. Then it vanished. His eyes returned to their normal state, cool, bright, calculating. He stood, brushed imaginary dust from his knees, turned to Abel. "Record it." He pointed at Josie and Aries. "Get them both in the frame. I want her and the dog together. Abel took out his phone and began filming. Bryce looked down at Josie one last time. You don't know who I'm sending this to, but he'll want to see it. He walked away, leather soles striking concrete, fading, gone. The iron door shut. Abel finished recording, sent the video along with a message and a set of coordinates Josie didn't know were false. Bait meant to draw Paxton into a trap. Then he left as well. Darkness. Silence. Cold. Josie lay on the floor, breathing in shallow waves of pain. She knew she was dying. Not in a dramatic sense, not in fear, but in the quiet, clinical way the body tells you it's shutting down. She turned her head toward Aries. The dog looked back at her, brown eyes clouded in the dark, still there, still unbroken. Josie lifted her left hand, the one gripping the chain, and pulled him closer. Every centimeter was agony, but she pulled until she felt warm slate-gray fur press against her chest. She whispered, her voice barely more than shaped breath. I'm sorry. I couldn't save you. Aries looked at her. Then he did the one thing he'd done since the beginning, the simplest and most devastating thing in the world. He licked her hand, the hand crusted with dried blood, blistered, skin torn. He licked gently, slowly, with that warm, rough tongue, as if saying in the only language he knew that she didn't need to apologize, that she had been enough, more than enough. Then he lowered himself carefully, placing his massive head on her chest, mindful even in his pain of her broken ribs, and closed his eyes. Then I'll stay here with you. Josie closed her eyes, her fingers still wrapped around the chain. She didn't let go. Consciousness slipped away slowly, like receding tide, until there was only darkness, and the weight of the dog against her, and the sound of his heartbeat against her ear. Steady. Slow. Still there. She didn't know the video Abel had just recorded was already moving through encrypted networks, hopping across 3 servers, and would reach the most dangerous man in Chicago within an hour. She didn't know that what he would do after watching it would make the entire underworld of the city tremble. 4 hours. Sawyer needed exactly 4 hours. He called in every pair of eyes on the street, every informant, every addict who owed money, every pawn shop owner, every night taxi driver, every woman working a corner who had a habit of memorizing license plates. The Corey intelligence network wasn't high technology. It was people, hundreds of people scattered across Chicago who understood one simple rule. When Paxton Corey asked, you answered. And if you didn't answer, you prayed. The lead came from the least expected source. A heroin addict sleeping beneath an overpass in the Western Industrial District. He'd been awake all night fighting withdrawal, and had noticed a white cargo van pulling into the last warehouse on the road 3 nights in a row at the same hour. He recognized Abel. He'd bought product once from Bryce's network. He sold the information to Sawyer's men for $200, and a promise no one would touch him. $200. That was the price of finding where Josie was slowly dying on a concrete floor. Midnight of the 3rd night. The abandoned industrial zone on Chicago's west side, where streetlights had long since died and weeds pushed through cracks in the asphalt. 20 men, armed, sitting in 5 black vehicles parked 200 meters from the warehouse. Headlights off, engines idling low. Sawyer sat in the driver's seat of the first car, his left shoulder still wrapped in white bandages, his right hand gripping a gun. He checked the rearview mirror. Paxton sat in the back seat, silent, steel-gray eyes fixed on the warehouse at the end of the road. He'd changed into a fresh suit, but hadn't shaved, hadn't combed his hair. His eyes carried something Sawyer had seen only once before, the day they identified Nico's body at the morgue. Boss, let me lead the entry. Sawyer's voice was low, professional. He already knew the answer, but he had to say it. No, one word. Paxton opened the car door and stepped out. That was all. Sawyer exhaled and followed. 20 men moved through the darkness like wolves. No flashlights, no chatter, only the crunch of boots on broken concrete and the quiet click of weapons being readied. The warehouse had 2 entrances, the main steel door at the front and an emergency exit at the back. Sawyer split the team, 10 at each door. Paxton stood at the front. Inside, 2 of Bryce's guards were playing cards on wooden crates, guns resting on the table, unsuspecting. 3, 2, 1. The steel door exploded inward under a battering ram. 20 men flooded in from both sides at once. Shouts, Gunfire. Metal striking metal. The two guards raised their hands before they could even reach their weapons. Forced to the ground. Bound. Gagged. From a small room at the back, Abel burst out, gun in hand, firing once into the wall. The second shot never came. A bullet from Paxton's men tore into his right knee. Abel collapsed, screaming, the gun skidding across the floor. Bound in 10 seconds. The remaining 3 scattered. 2 ran toward the rear exit and met 10 barrels aimed at their faces. They dropped to their knees. The last threw himself flat and pretended to be dead. No one cared. From start to finish. Less than 90 seconds. Silence returned to the warehouse. Gun smoke drifted beneath the flickering fluorescent lights. Paxton's men stood scattered, weapons trained on the restrained captors, and Paxton walked past all of it, past the splintered steel door, past Abel writhing on the floor, past the guards lying face down, past the smoke and the smell of gunpowder. He walked straight ahead, not glancing sideways, not slowing, toward the corner where the light flickered weakest. Then he stopped, and the world of Paxton Corey shifted. The girl lay on the concrete, smaller than she had seemed on the video, so small she almost disappeared against the gray floor. Her face was caked in dried blood, swollen beyond recognition, clothes torn, hands blistered and burned, her body mapped in old wounds and new, and her left hand still gripped Aries' chain. Even unconscious, even when her body had given up, her hand had not. Aries lay pressed against her, his 65-kilogram frame curved around her like a wall of flesh. When he heard Paxton's footsteps, the dog lifted his head and growled. Weak, exhausted, but growled. At his own owner, at Paxton Core, because anyone approaching this girl was a threat until proven otherwise. Paxton stopped 2 steps away. Aries looked at him, whimpered softly. His tail gave one faint movement of recognition, but he didn't move away from Josie. The dog looked at Paxton, then down at the girl, then back at Paxton. And Paxton, who had read this dog for 5 years, understood. Save her first. He went to his knees. 20 armed men scattered across the warehouse witnessed something none of them had ever seen, and none would ever forget. Paxton Corey, the crime lord Chicago feared, slid his arms beneath the unconscious girl and lifted her, gently. So gently, it was as if he feared she might break. Her head fell against his chest, blood-matted hair brushing the expensive black fabric of his suit. Her blood soaked through the cloth and spread across his chest. He didn't look down. He didn't care. He carried her across the warehouse, past men frozen in place, his voice level but heavy enough to anchor the air. Get her to Pemberton. Now. A beat. If she dies, I burn this city to the ground. No one asked who she was. No one asked why. They opened a car door, flattened the back seat, and watched Paxton lower the girl into the vehicle with hands that trembled slightly, a tremor he didn't try to hide. Aries limped after them, 3 legs moving unevenly across the concrete, the 4th dragging uselessly behind, but he refused to fall back. When Paxton placed Josie inside, the dog hauled himself into the car beside her, lay down at her side, rested his massive head against her leg, and looked at Paxton with brown eyes that said more clearly than words ever could. Go. Now. She's dying. She didn't know where she was before she knew she was in pain. Pain came first. It arrived before light, before sound, before awareness. Pain in her ribs, every breath like a blade forced between bone. Pain in her hands, burning, constant, unrelenting. Pain in her face, the left side numb and swollen, the right side throbbing sharp and hot. Pain everywhere at once, as if her entire body were a single wound shaped like a person. Then light. Not the sickly yellow flicker of fluorescent bulbs. This light was soft, white, steady, medical light. Then smell. Not oil and rust and damp concrete. Antiseptic, clean sheets, hospital. Then sound. Beep, 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 measured. A heart monitor. Josie opened her eyes. The right one first, a narrow slit. The left still swollen, barely parting. White ceiling, recessed lights, a ceiling fan turning slowly. Not a hospital, she realized after a few seconds. The room was smaller. Private. Real fabric curtains instead of plastic. Wooden cabinets instead of steel. Someone's room. Someone's private medical suite. Panic hit fast and hard, like a fist. Josie tried to sit up. Her body refused. Broken ribs screamed. She gasped and fell back against the pillows, tears springing from the shock of it. Where? Where? The warehouse. Abel. Aries. Her hand moved frantically across the sheets, searching for chain, for slate gray fur, for familiar warmth, and fear surged sharper when she found nothing. Then she felt it. Weight. To her left. On the bed. Something heavy. Warm. Alive. Breathing. She turned her head, forcing her swollen eye wider, and saw him. Aries. 65 kilograms of Neapolitan Mastiff curled on the mattress beside her, his massive body taking up more than half the bed. His slate gray coat had been cleaned of blood, his right front leg encased in white plaster, the iron collar replaced with a soft fabric one. His enormous wrinkled head rested against her abdomen, careful, gentle, avoiding her broken ribs as if he knew exactly where they hurt. His tail moved, slow, steady. When her eyes met his, it wagged faster. His brown eyes were clearer than in the warehouse. Cleaner, but they were the same eyes. The eyes that had never left her through 3 nights on a concrete floor. Josie began to cry, before she understood what had happened, before she asked who had brought her here, before she thought at all. Tears slipped from the narrow opening of her swollen eye, hot and salt against the pillow. Her hand trembled as she lifted it to his head. Burned fingers sank into warm velvet fur. "You're still here." 3 words. Her voice hoarse, fractured, barely sound at all. Aries heard. His tail thumped harder. He made a soft rumble and pressed his head into her palm, licking her fingers with careful precision, avoiding the worst of the burns the way only someone who had memorized the map of her wounds over 3 dark nights could. Josie lay there crying, her hand on the dog's head. Then she looked to her right and stopped. Beside the bed, in a leather chair, a man sat slumped forward, head tilted to one side, eyes closed, hands clasped tightly in his lap, even in sleep, as if refusing to let his body relax completely despite exhaustion. He wore a black suit. The same suit, and across his chest, over his heart, a dark brown stain had dried into the fabric. Blood. Her blood. From the night someone had lifted her off the warehouse floor. A moment she didn't remember. He hadn't changed clothes, hadn't gone home. Deep shadows carved beneath his eyes, 3 days of stubble rough along his jaw, black hair slightly disordered, his face sharp and severe, even in sleep holding a tension that never fully released, like a soldier resting in a battlefield trench. On the small table beside him, his phone lay lit, screen glowing softly with a photograph. Josie squinted. A younger man, round face, wide smile, holding Aries as a puppy, fur fluffy, wrinkled muzzle comically serious. An old picture. The man in the photo wasn't the man in the chair. Younger, softer, but there was something unmistakably similar in the lines of the face. Josie didn't know who the man in the chair was, didn't know his name, didn't know what he did or why he was here. She only saw this. A man who hadn't slept for days, who still wore a suit stained with her dried blood, who sat guard beside her and the dog she had nearly died protecting. He had come for her. Someone had come for her. In 27 years, through 7 foster homes, through 10 years alone, through every night she'd curled up in the dark of a 15-square-meter studio. No one had ever come looking for her. No one had ever sat beside her bed waiting for her to wake. No one had ever worn her blood on their clothes because they refused to leave long enough to change. Aries looked at Paxton sleeping in the chair, then back at Josie on the bed. His tail wagged harder, tapping against the mattress in steady rhythm. His brown eyes lit with something simple and bright and almost joyful. "Here, my human is here, both of you. She's awake." Josie lay still, tears soaking into the pillow, her hand resting on the dog's head, staring at the stranger asleep in the chair beside her bed. And for the first time in her life, she felt something she didn't have a word for. Heavy, warm, so real it almost hurt. Someone had come for her. Paxton felt her gaze before he opened his eyes. Not because he possessed any supernatural sense, but because he had lived 36 years in a world where a wrong look could be the last thing a man ever saw, and his body had been trained to register the weight of being watched. He opened his eyes. Josie was looking at him from the bed, her right eye barely open, her left still swollen but improved enough to form a thin slit. She didn't look away when he woke. She didn't have the strength to, or she didn't want to. An unfamiliar flicker of self-consciousness passed through Paxton Correa. He straightened in the chair, lifted a hand to push his hair back out of habit, jaw tightening as he tried to pull the cold composure back over himself, like armor he had worn for 15 years. But the dark hollows beneath his eyes betrayed him. The 3-day stubble betrayed him. And the dried brown-red stain over his heart betrayed him most of all, because it said he had carried a bleeding stranger in his arms and hadn't changed his clothes, hadn't left, had sat here waiting for her to wake. The door opened. A man stepped in, salt and pepper hair, gold-rimmed glasses, white coat, clipboard and stethoscope in hand. Pemberton, Paxton's private physician, the man who had treated every wound in the Core Empire for 12 years, without ever setting foot in a public hospital. He nodded once to Paxton and moved to Josie's bedside. "What's her name?" Pemberton asked without looking at him. "Don't know." Pemberton didn't press. He examined Josie with quick, professional movements, careful enough not to cause more pain. Light in her eyes, stethoscope against her chest, gentle pressure to her abdomen, inspection of the burns on her hands. Then he turned to Paxton and listed the damage in a clinical, even tone, loud enough that Josie heard every word. 3 broken ribs, 7, 8, and 9 on the left side, 1 dangerously close to the pleural lining. 2nd-degree burns on both hands, thermal, consistent with direct contact from cigarettes, fractured left cheekbone, minor internal tearing near the spleen, bleeding controlled but needs monitoring, severe blood loss, severe dehydration, and significant malnutrition. Pemberton paused at the last item and looked at Paxton over the rim of his glasses. She was underweight long before she was taken. Body mass index under 17. She's been hungry for a long time. Not days. Chronic. Months. Maybe years. The room went still. The monitor continued its steady rhythm. Aries breathed evenly on the bed, and Paxton stood unmoving, gray eyes fixed on the swollen face of the girl in the bed, and the detail about hunger struck him in a way that 3 days of torture had not. 3 days of torture were cruel. But years of hunger were something else. Slower, quieter, in some ways more merciless, because no one specific caused it and no one cared enough to stop it. Pemberton closed his clipboard, set medication and instructions on the bedside table, nodded once to Paxton, and left. The door shut. Only 2 people and 1 dog remained. Paxton stood beside the bed, not sitting, looking down at Josie. She looked back, and he asked, "Why?" 1 word. Low. Even. But not cold. Josie didn't understand at first. Her eye blinked slowly, exhaustion heavy in the movement. "Why did you endure that for a dog that wasn't yours?" She was quiet, not because she lacked an answer, but because she had to gather enough air to speak. Each word pressed against her broken ribs. Her voice came out hoarse, slow, each word a separate effort. "Because no one deserves to be treated like that." She stopped, breathed shallowly, then continued. "Especially when they can't defend themselves." Paxton watched her. No visible reaction, no nod, no shake of his head, just watching. "You didn't know whose dog it was?" "No." "You didn't know who you were up against?" "No." Josie held his gaze, swollen eye narrowed but steady, and it didn't matter. 4 words, heavier than the list of injuries Pemberton had just recited. 4 words that said she had known she might die, and had still chosen not to let go. Not because she was brave, not because she was foolish, but because for her, abandoning something in pain had never been an option, no matter the cost. Paxton studied her for a long moment, sharply, as if decoding the blueprint of something he had never encountered in 36 years, spent in a world where everything had a price and everyone had a motive. This girl had no motive, no price. She simply hadn't let go of the dog. So simple it was almost incomprehensible. He turned and walked toward the door, steps steady, controlled, the familiar rhythm returning. At the threshold he paused, without looking back, and said over his shoulder, "You're staying here until you're fully healed." It wasn't a suggestion. The door closed. His footsteps receded down the hall and disappeared. The room fell quiet again, only the soft beeping of the monitor and the steady sound of Aries breathing. Josie lay on the bed, eyes on the ceiling, hand resting on the dog's head, everything that had just happened, turning slowly in her mind. She didn't know where she was, didn't know who that man was, didn't know why he had a private doctor and a private medical suite and footsteps people obeyed. She only knew that he had found her, had carried her out of that warehouse, and had sat beside her bed in a blood-stained suit until she woke. She turned her head toward Aries. The dog looked back at her, tail giving a small, contented thump. Brown eyes calm. "Who exactly is your human, you giant?" Aries licked her hand. He didn't answer. 3 days later, Josie could sit up. Not easily. Every time she lifted her back from the pillows, her broken ribs reminded her with a sharp, slicing pain. But she could sit. Propped against the stack of pillows Pemberton had arranged behind her, she looked at the room with fully open eyes for the first time. Her left eye had healed enough to open halfway. Her right was nearly normal. Her hands were still wrapped in white bandages, but the burning had dulled. She was weak. She was sore, but she was awake, and she was alive. Aries lay beside her on the bed, his wrinkled head resting on her thigh, his tail moving in a slow rhythm every time she shifted. His leg was in a cast, limiting his movement, but he didn't need to go anywhere. Everything he needed was sitting right beside him. What Josie didn't know was that during the 3 days she had been recovering, her story had spread across the Chicago underworld. Not through newspapers, not through social media, through something older. Word of mouth. From Paxton's men whispering in hallways, to drivers telling chefs, chefs telling delivery men telling drinking buddies. The story moved from penthouse to street and back again, picking up layers each time, but the core never changed. A struggling girl. Small, thin, no money, just a tiny, crumbling room. No one. She found Paxton Correa's dog in an alley. Bryce Hadley tortured her for 3 days, and she didn't let go. Not because she knew whose dog it was, not because anyone paid her, not for any reason their world could understand. She didn't let go because she refused to abandon something in pain. That was all. And in a world where everything had a price, that kind of simplicity left men with only one possible response: respect. On the morning of the 3rd day, Josie heard footsteps in the hallway. More than one pair, not two, many, steady, sequential, like a quiet procession. The door opened. Sawyer entered first, his left arm still secured in a sling, his face as hard as ever, but his eyes softer in a way Josie didn't know was rare in him. He approached the bed without speaking, and placed a small black cloth box on the bedside table. Josie looked at the box, looked at him. He opened it. Inside lay a delicate silver bracelet, thin and finely made, a tiny engraved dog resembling Aries etched along the inside curve. "From me. You deserve it." 4 words, his tone flat, stripped of excess emotion, but enough. He closed the box, stepped aside, and nodded toward the door. After Sawyer came the 2nd man, then the 3rd, then the 4th, then dozens more. Josie sat on the bed and watched the line of men pass through her room, and she didn't understand what was happening. Most were large, scarred, tattooed, the kind of men she would have avoided eye contact with at 3 a.m. on the South Side. Paxton's men. Restaurant cooks, drivers, guards, allied bosses in tailored suits from the north side of the city. One by one they entered, left something on the table beside her bed, and walked out. A small bouquet, a container of homemade food still warm, white envelopes she didn't need to open to know held money, bottles of juice, bags of fruit, a new wool scarf. No one spoke much. One man simply nodded and left. Another removed his cap, bowed his head briefly, and turned away. A huge man nearly 2 meters tall, arms covered in ink, stepped inside, looked at Aries on the bed, then dropped to one knee and gently rubbed the dog's ear with a hand the size of a skillet. He looked up at Josie. "Thank you for keeping him safe, sister." His voice was deep, unsteady at the end. Then he stood and walked out. Josie couldn't speak. She sat with her hand on Aries' head and watched the procession, and tears slid down both swollen eyes, down bruised cheeks, down her chin, dripping onto the slate-gray fur beneath her fingers. Then the last group entered. They were older, gray-haired, stooped, hands trembling, men who had served the Correa family since before Paxton took control, men who had known Nico as a boy, who had seen him bring home a wrinkled puppy and laugh, announcing he would become a veterinarian one day. An old man with hair as white as snow stepped to the bedside. He looked at Aries, then at Josie. His lips trembled, his eyes filled. "Nico would have loved you." His voice broke. "You kept his dog alive," he cried, openly, without shame, standing in the middle of the room, crying with the grief of an old man who had buried too many young ones. Josie cried with him. Aries gave a soft rumble, his tail thumping lightly against the mattress, as if he felt the weight of the moment even if he didn't understand the words. In the hallway, Paxton Corey stood against the wall 3 steps from Josie's door. He didn't go in. He remained there all morning, watching each man pass, glancing through the open doorway, watching the small, thin girl on the bed weep, while some of the hardest killers in Chicago lowered their heads before her. Sawyer stood beside him in silence, then said quietly, just loud enough for Paxton to hear, "Your entire empire is kneeling to that girl because she did what none of us ever would. She risked her life and asked for nothing." Paxton didn't answer. His hand gripped the doorframe so tightly his knuckles turned white, and he looked into the room where Josie was crying with her hand resting on his brother's dog, and he said nothing, because there were no words large enough to hold what he was feeling. 2 weeks later, through sheer force of will, Josie took her first agonizing steps. Her left hand pressed against her ribs because the fractures still flared each time she twisted, but she could walk. The safe house was a wide apartment on the 12th floor of an unnamed building in Lincoln Park, the kind of place Josie had never stepped inside in her life. Oak floors, granite countertops, tall windows looking out toward Lake Michigan. She moved from the bedroom to the living room and back again, Aries limping after her, his cast tapping softly against the wood, refusing to fall more than 2 steps behind. She had grown used to the apartment, used to Pemberton stopping by each morning to check her vitals, used to food appearing on the kitchen island without her knowing who had delivered it, used to Sawyer's silent shadow passing in the hallway, but she hadn't grown used to not being hungry. She ate 3 meals a day, and still didn't believe it was real. That afternoon, the doorbell rang. Josie was sitting on the sofa with Aries stretched half on the floor, half across her legs. She looked up. The doorbell almost never rang here. Everyone who came and went used the keypad. Sawyer opened the door and stopped. In front of him stood a woman of 58, short, solid, salt and pepper hair twisted into a tight bun. A white apron still dusted with flour and dotted with oil stains, her eyes swollen red as if she'd cried the entire way. In her hands she carried a pot of chicken soup nearly half her size. Ruthie. Josie didn't know how Ruthie had found her. Later she would learn that Ruthie had gone to the gas station, to Josie's old studio, to the police station, to hospitals, and finally spotted a black SUV she recognized from the gas station. She followed it to the building, where Sawyer, recognizing her from surveillance reports, allowed her to pass. "Who are you?" Sawyer asked, his right hand resting near the gun at his waist, eyes scanning her from head to toe. Ruthie looked at the man who towered over her, who carried a gun, who wore scars and the face of someone who had killed, and she didn't blink. "I'm the one who's fed that girl for 2 years. Now move." Sawyer didn't move. He glanced over her shoulder toward Paxton, standing at the far end of the hall. Paxton looked at the woman with flour on her apron, red eyes, clutching a pot of soup, standing at the door of his safe house and ordering his most loyal guard aside. He gave a single nod. Sawyer stepped back. Ruthie walked straight in without looking at Sawyer, without looking at Paxton, without noticing the expensive apartment. Her eyes searched for only one person. She turned into the living room, saw Josie on the sofa, and nearly buckled. The pot tipped in her hands. Sawyer moved quickly and caught it before it fell. She didn't notice. She only saw Josie. Saw the bruises not yet faded from her face, the fresh scar along her cheekbone, the bandaged hands, the way she sat slightly twisted because of her ribs. Josie stood, slowly, painfully, but she stood because she saw Ruthie and everything she had held together for 10 days. The strength, the composure, the endurance, shattered at once. They met in the middle of the living room and held each other. Ruthie wrapped her in flour-dusted arms, tight but careful of the left side, because she knew how to hold someone who hurt. She had held Josie that way 100 times over 2 years whenever Josie needed it, and didn't know how to ask. Josie pressed her face into Ruthie's shoulder and breathed in oil and flour and sweat, and Ruthie, the closest thing she had ever had to home. "I thought you were dead, you stupid girl," Ruthie cried, voice breaking, tears falling into Josie's hair. "I thought you were dead. I'm sorry, Ruthie. Don't you dare apologize." Ruthie pulled back, cupped Josie's face in both hands, and stared into her eyes with fierce, red-rimmed intensity. "Don't ever apologize for doing the right thing." Aries, lying beside the sofa, lifted his head and watched the unfamiliar woman holding his human. He didn't growl. He sniffed, wrinkled nose brushing her leg, then leaned his massive head against Ruthie's calf, tail giving a soft thump. Ruthie looked down through tears and saw the dog Josie had nearly died for. 65 kilograms of wrinkled face and steady brown eyes, looking up at her with calm trust. "So you're the one. You're the reason my girl almost died." Her voice trembled but carried no anger. She knelt with a crack of aging knees and stroked his ears. Aries closed his eyes and pressed into her palms. "You'd better be worth it, you giant." Half an hour later, Ruthie had taken over the kitchen of the safe house, reheated the chicken soup, forced Josie to eat 2 bowls, and scolded her for being too thin. Before she left, she stepped into the hallway and found Paxton waiting near the door. She stopped, looked at him. He looked back. Paxton Correa, the man Chicago feared, standing before a 58-year-old woman holding an empty soup pot, and that woman lifted a finger and pointed it straight at his chest. "I don't care who you are. That girl has suffered her whole life. If you let anyone hurt her again, including you, I'll find you. I don't need a gun." Sawyer shifted behind Paxton, hand brushing his weapon on instinct. But Paxton lifted a hand to stop him. He studied the woman who dared to threaten him inside his own stronghold, and something at the edge of his eyes softened. "Not much, but enough. You fed her for 2 years?" 2 years. Then from now on, we both will." Ruthie held his gaze, long, measuring, weighing. Then she nodded once, decisive. "Fine, but I cook. You just pay." A few days after Ruthie's visit, Josie moved more comfortably through the safe house. She still hurt. Her ribs still flared when she turned too quickly. Her hands were still wrapped in white gauze, though the skin beneath had begun to mend. The bruises on her face had faded from deep violet to sickly yellow and green, the quiet colors of a body repairing itself. She explored the apartment 1 room at a time, slowly, with the cautious curiosity of someone who had never lived in a space larger than 15 square meters. The living room held a leather sofa that Aries claimed as his own. The granite kitchen counters gleamed so clean, she hesitated to cook, afraid of leaving a mark. The bathroom had hot water that ran without sputtering or apology, a luxury so overwhelming that the first time she stood beneath the shower, she did nothing for 10 minutes, but let the warmth pour over her skin and fight the urge to cry. That afternoon, Josie stood in the kitchen pouring water into Aries' bowl. The dog sat at her feet, tail tapping lightly against the hardwood in steady anticipation. She set the bowl down and watched him drink, a small smile forming without effort. Then she heard voices. From the adjacent room, the door slightly ajar, Paxton's voice, but not the voice she knew. Not the low voice that had asked her why, not the quiet command at her bedside that she would stay until healed. This voice was different. Cold, sharp, metallic. Clean out Bryce's men in the South District. All of them. No exceptions. Sawyer's voice answered. Lower, controlled. "There are 2 mid-level operators trying to hold the Eastern Territory." "Handle it," Paxton said. 1 word, flat, as if discussing trash removal. Sawyer continued in the same professional tone, though the content was anything but ordinary. Territory, money, shipments, eliminate, cleanse. Words Josie didn't need a college education to understand. She froze in the kitchen, the water bottle still in her hand. The pieces arranged themselves in her mind with dizzying speed. This apartment, a private doctor, 20 armed men storming a warehouse, dozens of scarred, tattooed men lowering their heads to her bedside, Sawyer with a gun at his waist. And Paxton Correa, the man who had sat beside her in a blood-stained suit, was not a businessman. Not merely wealthy. He was the boss. Mafia. Her heart climbed into her throat. The bottle trembled in her grip, water sloshing over the granite and dripping to the floor. Aries lifted his head, stopped drinking, ears alert. Josie set the bottle down carefully, trying not to make a sound, then stepped back. Instinct surged. Old instinct. The foster care instinct she'd learned at 4 years old. When the environment shifts toward danger, run. Run fast. Don't look back. Don't trust anyone, because every time you trust, you get hurt. She retreated into the bedroom, closed the door, sat on the edge of the bed, arms wrapped around her knees, breath coming too fast. Her eyes scanned the room for exits. Front door, guarded by Sawyer. Window, 12 stories up. Fire escape at the end of the hall. Maybe reachable if she moved quickly enough. She trembled. Not because she feared Paxton. If he had wanted to harm her, he could have done so already. He didn't need to rescue her and sit 3 days beside her bed just to destroy her later. She trembled because she feared herself, feared that she had begun to believe in this apartment, in 3 meals a day, in steady hot water, in the man who had asked her why, without cruelty in his voice. Every time in her 27 years that she had allowed herself to believe a place was home or a person was safe, it had ended in pain. 7 families, 7 times she believed. 7 times it shattered. Tears rose hot and angry, falling onto her knees. Not because Paxton was Mafia, but because she had started to feel safe, and now she didn't know whether she was allowed to. Nails tapped softly against hardwood outside her door, then a gentle, patient scratch. Josie opened it. Aries stood there, leg in a cast, tail wagging slow and steady, brown eyes calm. He had followed her, as always. He limped inside, moved to the bed, and rested his heavy head against her thigh. Warm, solid, familiar. Josie looked down at him. This dog had been tortured beside her. This dog had pressed against her body through 3 nights on freezing concrete. He hadn't left her side even under iron chains and metal batons. He trusted her, and he trusted Paxton. He had recognized Paxton in the warehouse. His tail had wagged. He had slept on Paxton's bed for 5 years. He knew who that man was, and he was still here. Josie's breathing slowed. Her hand moved to Aries' ear, fingers sinking into warm velvet fur. She remembered the last time she ran. 17 years old, fleeing her final foster home, running to the streets, losing everything. 10 years later, what did she have? A 15-square-meter studio, half a packet of noodles, and loneliness. This time she had Aries. This time someone had come looking for her. What she feared losing now was larger than what she feared facing. She didn't run. Footsteps approached the door. Paxton. He stopped at the threshold, didn't step inside, didn't crowd her, gave her space. He looked at her eyes and read everything. The redness, the tear tracks, the defensive posture. He knew she had heard. "Are you afraid?" 2 words. Low. Not threatening. Not gentle. Simply asking. Josie stood. She didn't remain seated looking up at him as she had before. She stood, turned her back slightly, looked out the window where Chicago stretched beneath the fading light, her hands trembling though her spine remained straight. Then she spoke, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers, the voice of someone who had made a decision and wouldn't retreat from it. "I was tortured for 3 days by your enemies. You're the one who came to get me. Who exactly should I be afraid of?" She turned and faced him. Her gray eyes met his steel gray ones. And in Paxton Curry's gaze, something shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone untrained, but if Sawyer had been standing there, he would have recognized it. He had watched those eyes for 12 years. Something opened, or something broke, and it would never close again. That night the safe house was quiet, the kind of quiet Chicago rarely allowed. No sirens, no shouting, no wind cutting between buildings, only the steady hum of the heater and the slow rhythm of Aries breathing on the floor. Josie sat curled into the corner of the sofa, knees drawn up, back against the armrest, wearing an oversized hoodie someone had left folded in her closet. It was soft, warm, softer and warmer than anything she had ever owned. Aries lay stretched out, half on the hardwood, half across her legs, his heavy, wrinkled head resting on her calf, eyes half closed. His cast rested on a pillow she had positioned carefully beneath it. Across from her, in the armchair, Paxton sat, a glass of whiskey in his hand, untouched. He turned it slowly, watching the amber catch the lamplight, the reflection sliding across the ceiling in thin waves. He came every night. No announcement, no invitation. He simply appeared, took that chair, sometimes spoke a few words, sometimes none at all, sometimes only sat and watched Aries resting against her before leaving. Tonight he stayed longer. Josie looked out the window at the city lights scattered along the lake, Chicago glowing in the distance. She reached for her water glass, and the hoodie slipped from her shoulder without her noticing, exposing the upper part of her back. Paxton noticed. The scars, not one, many, long, horizontal, parallel lines running from her left shoulder blade down toward the middle of her back. Faded white, healed long ago, years ago. These weren't from Bryce, not from Abel. They belonged to another chapter entirely, a chapter she had never told. Paxton didn't ask. He said nothing. He looked, then deliberately looked away, then took a sip of whiskey he didn't taste because his mind was elsewhere. He waited. Silence stretched. Aries breathed. The lamp cast gold light. Then Josie spoke. Not because he asked. She spoke because sometimes, when silence feels safe enough, the words find their own way out. Her voice was flat, distant, as if she were narrating the life of someone she once knew but didn't quite claim as herself anymore. The last foster family. She was 13 when she arrived. Family number 7. The foster mother wasn't cruel, just weak. Unable to protect anyone, not even herself. The foster father was different. He didn't drink, didn't shout, didn't look dangerous. He was quiet, controlled, methodically cruel. He used a belt. Not in anger, in discipline, he called it. If Josie disobeyed, she was beaten. If she spoke without being asked, she was beaten. If she cried, she was beaten for crying. The scars on her back were a record of the times she wasn't perfect enough for a man no one else controlled. She endured for a year. Then she found Penny. Josie paused at the name. Her steady voice wavered. Penny. A small beagle mix. Floppy ears. Round brown eyes. Patchy white and tan fur. Thin enough that her ribs showed through her skin. Josie found her on the street at 14. Hid her in her room. Fed her from her own plate. Penny curled against her at night. And for the first time in 10 years of foster care, Josie had something that was hers. Not the system's. Not a foster family's. Hers. The foster father found Penny 2 months later. Josie came home from school and heard the yelp from the backyard. She ran, and she saw. She didn't give details. She didn't have to. 4 words were enough. He killed her. Silence followed, long, heavy. Only the heater's hum and Aries' steady breathing. Josie looked down at the dog resting across her legs, gray eyes wet but not crying. She had cried enough for Penny years ago, night after night until there were no tears left, only something harder than tears. That's why I couldn't leave Aries. Her voice was low now, firm. I couldn't watch that happen again. Not again. Paxton said nothing. He didn't say I understand, because he didn't. He had grown up protected, provided for. He had lost his brother, but he had at least had a brother to lose. The distance between his life and hers was too wide for cheap comfort. So he didn't offer it. He simply reached across the space between their chairs and placed his hand over hers, not gripping, not squeezing, just resting there, warm, solid, letting her know he was here, letting her know he had heard, letting her know this hand didn't strike. After a long moment, Paxton spoke, his voice lower than she had ever heard it, lower than when he gave orders, lower even than when he spoke to Aries in the morning. Nico did the same. My brother saved Aries from a bad place. He was starving, locked in a metal cage at a black market yard. Nico brought him home, bathed him, slept with him that first night. He stopped, looked at Aries lying across her legs. The dog his brother had rescued, the dog she had kept alive. You remind me of him more than anyone I've ever met. Josie didn't answer. There were no words she needed. She simply turned her hand, palm up, allowing his hand to rest inside hers, not gripping, not holding tight, just there. 2 hands touching in soft yellow light. Aries sensed the shift in the air. He heaved himself upright, maneuvered his 65-kilogram body until he lay stretched between them, head on Josie's thigh, tail brushing against Paxton's leg. 3 beings marked by loss. A man who lost a brother. A girl who lost her childhood. A dog who nearly lost his life. Sitting in the quiet of a 12th floor apartment, needing nothing more than the honesty of silence. 2 nights later, just past midnight, Paxton left the safe house without telling anyone except Sawyer. Josie was asleep. Aries curled beside her on the bed, his massive head resting over her stomach, his tail twitching slowly in whatever dream dogs are allowed to have. Paxton stood in her doorway for a long moment, watching them. Then he turned and walked away. He didn't tell her where he was going. She didn't need to know. Sawyer drove in silence. 2 men sitting in the dark, dashboard lights washing faint color across faces carved from restraint. Neither spoke during the 30-minute drive across the city. They reached the Western Industrial District just before 1 in the morning. The same district, the same road, the same warehouse. Paxton had ordered everything left untouched after the raid. No cleaning, no repairs, nothing moved. The steel door still bent inward from the battering ram. The fluorescent light still flickered, too alive, too dead. The concrete floor still carried stains, Josie's blood, dried dark brown, trailing from the iron chair to the far corner where she had lain with Aries. The chair remained bolted to the floor, the old rope still draped across the armrests, and in that chair now sat Bryce Hadley, wrists bound to the arms, ankles tied to the legs, exactly the way Josie had been restrained. Bryce looked different from the last time he'd occupied this warehouse. The black wool coat was gone, replaced with a wrinkled t-shirt. His dirty blonde hair hung loose and uneven. The clean banker's face now bore a bruised cheekbone and dried blood beneath his nose, evidence that his capture had not been polite. But his eyes were still bright, still calculating, still scanning the room for exits he already knew weren't there. He was the kind of man who believed there was always another move, until Paxton stepped inside. Not hurried, each step measured against the concrete, slow, rhythmic, like a man taking an evening walk. He wore a black suit, black shirt, black shoes. He looked as though he were arriving at a gala rather than an abandoned warehouse at 1 a.m. In his right hand he carried a small cloth bag. He stopped in front of Bryce, didn't speak at once. He looked at him, looked long, then lowered his gaze to the floor, tracing the dried blood from the chair to the corner, the path Josie had crawled each night to reach Aries. He followed that dark line carefully, as if reading it. Then he looked back at Bryce and spoke, his voice calm, even, not raised, not lowered, no shouting, no threats, the tone of a man commenting on the weather or reading a grocery list, and that calm was more chilling than any scream. 3 days. She endured 3 days in that chair. She didn't know who I was, didn't know whose dog it was. She was just a 27-year-old girl weighing 50 kilos, chronically hungry, with no one in this world. And she looked your men in the face and said, "Hit me instead of the dog." Paxton opened the cloth bag, placed the first item on the metal table beside the chair. The wire, twisted, bent, dried brown blood clinging to the edges where it had cut into Aries' muzzle. Strands of slate-gray fur still caught at either end. "You used this on my brother's dog." He set down the second item. A pack of cigarettes. The same brand. The same kind. The kind Abel had drawn out, lit, and pressed into Josie Brennan's palms until her skin blistered and burned. And this on her. Silence settled heavy between them. The fluorescent light flickered, casting shifting shadows along the concrete walls. The blood on the floor looked darker under the erratic glow. And Bryce Hadley, the man who always believed he had another move, who smiled while ordering a stranger's torture because it made strategic sense, felt fear for the first time in his life. Not fear of pain. He'd been beaten before. He understood pain. He feared something else. He feared the calm. Feared the stillness in Paxton Curry's eyes. Not the heat of rage, but the quiet of a decision already made. Final. Irreversible. Beyond negotiation. No moves left. Paxton studied him for 3 more seconds, then spoke again in the same even tone, each word dropping like stone into a deep well. "I won't kill you quickly, Bryce. I'll give you 3 days, just like you gave her." He turned, walked away, each step echoing against concrete, unhurried, identical to the rhythm of his entrance. He didn't look back. As he passed through the doorway, Sawyer stepped inside. 40 years old, face unreadable, left shoulder still bandaged, right hand uninjured. He looked at Bryce in the iron chair, said nothing, pulled a wooden chair across the floor and placed it directly opposite, sat down, and waited. The steel door shut. Metal striking metal rang through the warehouse and faded, then silence, only the faint flicker of fluorescent lights, Bryce's breathing, and Sawyer's patience. 3 days. 6 months later, the late afternoon sun of Chicago pours through the glass walls of the penthouse on the 43rd floor. The warm fullness of May light, so different from the bone-cutting cold of that November night when everything began. Josie stands in the kitchen, a wooden spoon in her hand, stirring a pot of soup on the gas stove, Ruthie's recipe that she has memorized after dozens of stubborn phone calls with the older woman correcting every small detail. The kitchen smells of stewed chicken and fresh dill. At her feet, Aries lies stretched across the stone floor, 65 kilograms of muscle and wrinkled skin taking up half the room, his right front leg long freed from its cast, though still slightly stiff when the weather turns cold, his massive creased head resting on his paws, eyes half closed, snoring softly. Now and then his nose twitches as the scent of soup drifts past. His tail thumps once and grows still again. Josie is no longer thin. There is color in her cheeks. Her cheekbone has healed, though if someone looks closely, they can see it sits just a little uneven. Her gray eyes no longer carry the wild, guarded look of an animal cornered. Brown hair falls loose over her shoulders instead of being tied in a careless knot at the nape of her neck. She wears a soft sweater and loose trousers, bare feet against the warm floor, looking like someone who has lived here all her life, rather than someone who, 6 months ago, was dying slowly on a warehouse floor with her hand wrapped around a dog's chain. The scars remain. On both hands, the burns have healed into pale pink new skin, smooth and unfamiliar against the rest of her flesh. On her face, a faint line along the left cheek, where the bone once broke. On her back, older marks, white and parallel, belonging to another chapter. She doesn't hide them. She doesn't wear gloves. She doesn't pull high collars closed. She doesn't turn her face away when someone looks. Scars are a map, and she has walked every road on that map and is still here. On the refrigerator, 2 photographs sit side by side under magnets. The one on the left is old, yellowed at the corners. Nico holding Aries when he was just a puppy. All fluff and wrinkles. Nico smiling wide, eyes bright, chin resting on the dog's head. The one on the right is new, taken 2 months ago. Josie sitting on the living room floor, Aries in her lap, that enormous head facing the camera with the same solemnly comical expression he wore as a pup, and Josie, smiling, not as wide as Nico, smaller, more cautious, but real. 2 photographs, 2 people, the same dog, a family extended through loss. The lock turns at the door. Footsteps cross the wooden floor of the hallway. Aries lifts his head, ears up, tail whipping wildly, and charges out of the kitchen with a heavy limp in his step so fast, Josie has to step aside to keep from being knocked over. 65 kilograms of dog barrels into Paxton at the door, head rubbing against his thigh, wet nose pressing into his hand, tail slamming against the wall, the table leg, anything within reach, with the pure, unhidden joy of a creature that doesn't know how to pretend. Paxton bends down, both hands cradling the dog's head, scratching behind his ears, murmuring something too soft for anyone but Aries to hear, in a voice so gentle the Corey Empire would never believe it exists. Josie turns from the stove and looks at him. He looks back. She offers a small smile, not radiant, not promising anything, just the smile of someone who finally has a place to come home to. Paxton nods in return. No kiss, no embrace, no sweet words, only a look, a shared presence. The kind of family neither of them ever truly had, yet somehow found in the last place anyone would have expected. Josie's phone rings on the kitchen counter. She picks it up. "Girl, I cooked too much again. Let me bring it over." Ruthie's voice booms through the speaker, decisive, not waiting for permission. Josie laughs, a light, natural sound, the kind she didn't know she possessed until 6 months ago. "Ruthie, you cook too much every day. Then I'll feed the whole family, even that cold-faced man." Josie lowers herself to the kitchen floor beside Aries, leaning back against the cabinet, her hand stroking the dog's ear. Aries stretches out, places his head on her thigh, and closes his eyes. Paxton sits down beside her, back against the wall, legs extended, and Aries, as always, shifts his massive body until he's touching them both, lying between them, connecting them. 3 beings marked by life. A man who lost his brother and locked his heart for 2 years until a stranger girl was tortured for his brother's dog and forced it open again. A girl who lost her childhood in the foster care system and lived 10 years trusting no one until an abandoned dog in an alley gave her a reason to try again. A dog caged, beaten, chained, yet never ceasing to trust a gentle hand, still licking the wounds of the one who saved him, still lying close to her even while iron rods struck his body, because he doesn't know how to abandon anyone who has loved him. In the end, all 3 rest quietly in the same kitchen, in the same home, beneath the late May sunlight of Chicago. Josie Brennan, a girl who had spent her life invisible and alone, endured 3 days of torture for a dog she didn't know. She had no family, no one, nothing but an instinct that refused to abandon a creature in pain, and that dog led her home, to the man the entire city fears, yet who knelt and lifted her in his arms, to the stubborn older woman who refuses to stop cooking, to the enormous wrinkled dog who takes up the entire bed each night. Josie finally has a family. Not the one she was born into, but the one that chose her. and that she chose in return. This story reminds us that kindness doesn't require a reason, that courage isn't measured by strength, and that sometimes what heals the deepest wounds isn't medicine or money, but the presence of someone who refuses to walk away. In real life, we don't have to be heroes to change someone's world. Sometimes we simply have to not turn away when we see someone hurting. If Josie's story touched you, please press like and share so more people can hear it. Subscribe to the channel to listen with us to new stories every day. We would truly love to know how you feel, what this story stirred inside you, whether there was a moment that brought you to tears, whether a character reminded you of someone in your own life. Please share your thoughts from deep within your heart in the comments below. Rate the story on a scale of 10 and tell us where you're watching from. Every comment you leave gives us the strength to keep telling stories that deserve to be heard. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.